Oh, alright, guys. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Sorry about that little mic issue, but we are headed into our fourth segment of the show here, and as always, we have to conclude our positional rankings with our defense and special teams units for the day. Now, the four defenses I have chosen for this particular week are four defenses that, yes, I like the matchups for them, but also have this opportunistic feel to them. Some of them are dominant defenses, at least this season. But most of them, out of the four of them, are defenses that I feel like can take advantage of the errors of opposing offense, especially opposing offenses like they are facing this week. And so I feel like, this list, as well as my tight end list, was perhaps the toughest to compile this week, just because you never know what defense can surprise you. But in terms of how I view defense, it's a very volatile position that allows for you to interpret it whatever way you want. And that's what I want to do with these rankings. I like to throw in teams that I feel like are matchup-oriented situations, but I also want to throw in teams that, are, like I said, more opportunistic than dominant, because sometimes that matters a lot from a fantasy perspective. And it mattered actually to me this past week with the Steelers. They got timely turnovers in important crunch time situations to help me win my fantasy game. So you never really know. Without further ado, let's jump right into my final positional rankings of the week. Starting off with a team that fits more in that opportunistic category than others on this list, the Commanders' defense, going up against the Giants. And yes, it was more so a damage control performance against the Chicago Bears, but it proved to me the Washington Commanders are capable of holding offenses to low points totals. And not for nothing, this is a Commanders team that can get driven on. And not for nothing, on the other side of things in this matchup, this is a Giants team that can put together sustained drives. But the key thing to remember here, and the key word in my opinion, is implosion. Because what we saw with the Giants against the Steelers was that in inopportune moments, the Giants' offense didn't show up. When they were in the red zone, they turned the ball over, and they did not punch the football in. They did not score points in those situations. And when I look at the Commanders side of things, yes, they're not the best defense. Their secondary is a little skeptical. Their pass rush has been a little bit underwhelming in certain times. At the end of the day, what I love about certain defenses in fantasy is that they can take advantage of the timely errors of others and use it to their advantage. And that seems to be the definition of what the Washington Commanders can do when they're at their best defensively. They can limit the damage, they can get turnovers, and they can turn those turnovers into points. And so, I feel like in this game, pretty easy matchup, where they have to be wary of the Giants because there are moments where they can get you. I feel like the Commanders can prove that you don't necessarily have to be a dominant defense that doesn't allow X amount of points to be a team that can succeed in a fantasy perspective. So that's why I picked the Commanders. But this could come back to bite me because I could feel like this is a trap game for the Commanders. But who knows? And we'll have to see this Sunday. Then another team that is kind of in both of these categories, dominant and opportunistic, because of the fact that A, nobody expected them to be as dominant as they are this season, and B, they feel like one of those teams that, on the defensive side of football, are predicated on physicality that could translate to turnovers. Not saying that they always will. Their physicality leads me to believe that this team can be raking in some turnovers in the coming weeks. And against this Colts offense, that yes, with the addition of Joe Flacco, looks a bit more promising, but still is a little bit challenged in some areas. I feel like this Vikings defense can't be overlooked. Yes, they've had a little bit of a come down in these past two games where they got kind of beaten up a little bit. But I still have faith in them in certain matchups against these, inferior teams, that they can prove their worth as a fantasy defense to be reckoned with. And not for nothing, I do have to consider now this whole Joe Flacco situation, but I think that the reason why I'm still so high on the Vikings defense, even with Joe Flacco, is because Joe Flacco is great in certain areas and terrible in others, and one of them is under pressure. I feel like, this Colts team isn't as well equipped to handle certain moments as that Browns team last year to better protect Joe Flacco. So there will be some moments where he looks a bit shaky. And the Vikings defense are one of those teams that take that into account and take advantage of weakened fronts. And so that's why I feel like Joe Flacco, especially now without, any real semblance of a run game, will be challenged by this Vikings defense. And the reason why I think this Vikings defense will come out on top in that encounter. But let me know what you think about that, because they are a team that can fit any description for what you might want in a fantasy defense. And they've proven that they still have vulnerabilities, they still have flaws. But in certain matchups, you can't ignore the fact that Brian Flores' defense, more often than not, has looked one of the best in the NFL. As Flashbro mentions, Minnie has to give us one good result before I'm back in them. Last year they faded late. Flores may be a puzzle good OCs can solve. I feel like, Brian Flores is still someone who has his skepticism. And I feel like a lot of people, still need to see a full season of his success to warrant giving him the plaudits he deserves. But let's be real here. Minnesota didn't have much hope before the season anyways. So, at this point in the season, me saying that they're a defense that, from a fantasy perspective, is sitting in a position where I feel like week in, week out, they can dominate for you, that's something that Vikings fans, I feel, have to take and accept. Yes, right now you're in a weird position, but your schedule, is tough, but you feel like you're going to still be in games. And, that Rams game certainly felt like a trap game. You didn't know Kupp and Nakua were going to come back and play as well as they were. And now you have to go into this Colts game thinking that you're still the team that for the first 6 weeks of the season, really was one of the league's best. And so, for the time being, I'm not ready to write this Vikings team or this defense off just yet. But I do agree with you, Splash Bro, when you say that you need to keep the sacks up, because generating pressure is what this defense does best. And so, if they can't generate consistent pressure, then that's where I feel like trepidation will start to creep in for me, because this Vikings secondary, while I feel like it can get papered over a little bit, can be its most vulnerable unit on the defense. But let me know what you continue to think about Minnesota, because they are going to be a weird team to monitor down the stretch. But going over to a defense that would like to return the favor, so to speak, in this quote-unquote revenge game in the AFC East. The Dolphins defense going up against the Bills after, all the things that happened in the first iteration of this game this season. Now, I feel like the Dolphins defense is one of those defenses that's so middling, yet still has the talent to deliver for you, that you can't really gauge week in, week out what kind of version of the Dolphins defense we're going to get. Because I love the talent they have, I love what they could be, but I can't help ignore the fact that, or I can't help understand the fact that, this team is riddled with injuries on that side of the football. They don't necessarily seem to be stout in one particular department or one particular metric. And, teams feel like they can score on them. We've seen it this season, where they feel like they can pull away, but because of defensive ineptitudes, they just can't seem to pull games out. But this game against the Bills is a nice little proving ground for them that they can stay in games, can stay at the very least in the AFC playoff picture, not necessarily in the AFC East picture. But I do feel like this Dolphins defense has games in them where they prove that they're one of the league's elite. And not for nothing, that ranking, the middle of the pack ranking, does not indicate, troubles or fears about this Dolphins defense. It just indicates that they are more up and down than we expect them to be. And they're volatile. And so that's why I feel like a lot of people might be shying away from them. But this week, look for them to return the favor against a Bills unit that looks like they're on fire, but can be prone to being sprung a surprise. Now, the last teams I want to talk about, this one is very much matchups oriented. A defense that could be having its quote-unquote last hurrah here before a lot of these pieces could move around the league, so to speak. The Patriots defense, going up against a very erratic Titans offense, whether Mason Rudolph or Will Levis is leading it. Now, the Patriots defense is a defense that I feel predicates itself on moments. Moments for certain players in certain areas of the game where they can take away what looks like a big play for the opposing team. They can flip the script, so to speak. And yes, I can see why the Patriots could be sellers from this defensive line and from this secondary, but I still feel like their defense needs to keep them in games going forward. And so if pieces such as Devon Godchaux leave, or, someone in their secondary leaves, then it really will be to their detriment. That being said, I feel like in these matchups where you're not necessarily playing an opponent you feel like you should lose against, then why not take a flyer on them? They're a team that still has defensive talent enough to beat up on teams they can beat up on. It's just that, there's not much hope surrounding it when there's talks and rumors rumbling surrounding the fact that a lot of these guys could leave. And so that's why I feel like this whole Patriots defense is up in the air at the moment, and this could be one of those games where they throw caution to the wind and play one of their best defensive games as a unit. So, let me know what you think about these four defenses in the comments, because now we're starting to get into pick and choose. It's not going to be defined week in, week out which defense will step up for you. You're going to have to make some difficult decisions. But coming up to conclude today's show, I'll give you my weekly Shatter Report. The key wide receiver cornerback matchups that I feel will define the week in fantasy football. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back to conclude today's show.